Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Liu, Vice President of Capital Markets here at CFI, and I'd like to welcome you back to this week's CFI Deeper Dive, a weekly show where CFI dives into the concepts behind financial market events to help you stay ahead of the curve. The big news this week in the financial markets was the surprise announcement on Sunday by several members of the OPEC Cartel to voluntarily cut a further combined 1.16 million barrels per day of production, starting in May and lasting until the end of 2023. This news rattled equity markets and other risk assets, but also sent analysts scrambling to update their projections, not only for the price of oil, but also for the impact on economic growth. So some of you may ask, why did they choose to cut production? Well, most market observers believe that the answer is economic in nature. Oil prices have fallen to their lowest levels in 15 months after the recent banking crisis in the US and Europe, and the group has stated that they want to maintain price stability by restricting the supply of oil. Geopolitics may have also played a role. OPEC, or the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, is a bloc of 13 member nations that started in 1960. These countries combined hold an estimated 80% of crude oil reserves around the world. In 2016, OPEC Plus was created with another 10 member countries added, including Russia. This makes OPEC Plus responsible for supplying roughly 40% of the world's petroleum, and they operate as a cartel, which means they agree to control supply in order to keep prices high. As the Russia-Ukraine war continues, the production cuts announced by OPEC Plus this week may benefit Russia and her allies, as Russia desperately needs the revenues from oil to continue financing the war effort. The United States and NATO allies obviously don't want higher prices to benefit Putin, going as far as to restrict oil sales, as well as cap the prices that G7 countries can pay for Russian oil. Russia has been selling oil to China, who obviously are not a part of the Western sanctions, as post-COVID production starts ramping up in China. China, as you can see here, is a net importer of petroleum products. Geopolitically, this OPEC Plus production cut can therefore be seen as providing some relief to Russia and a further shift away from the interests of the US and our allies. So moving away from geopolitics, what does all this mean for the markets? Well, obviously, we did see the price of crude jump first thing on Monday morning when the markets opened. And since oil is the major raw material that goes into gasoline and other petroleum products, a jump in the price of oil has major implications on downstream prices, transport costs, as well as consumer spending overall. Goldman Sachs, for example, has updated their forecast for oil to get up to $95 a barrel by the end of 2023 and to over $100 by next year. All this also makes it much more difficult for the Fed and other central banks to control inflation, as higher input prices and transport costs will lead to higher prices for consumers. After all, crude oil accounts for more than half of the price of producing gasoline. Additionally, as the U.S. and many Western countries head into summer, the demand for gasoline normally rises as consumers travel on vacation. Interestingly, there are some things that the U.S. can do to help ease this pressure. Firstly is the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, called the SPR for short, a stockpile of over 370 million barrels of oil. My colleague Colby Evans has talked about this reserve in the past, but it can be used only as a temporary buffer to help offset higher crude oil prices. However, the reserves themselves are now roughly half of the peak, as the U.S. has drawn steadily from them during COVID. So more importantly, the U.S. is a major producer of oil, and one of these key sources of U.S. oil is shale oil, which are fossil fuels trapped in tight underground shale formations in the U.S. The fuel can be extracted by a process called fracking, where water, sand, and other chemicals are injected into the shale rock, forcing the oil out. However, the process is expensive, potentially environmentally damaging, and produces oil that needs to be blended with heavier oil to refine. But if oil prices continue to march higher, it is possible that U.S. oil companies will increase their production, which may keep prices lower at the pump. In any event, this theme is likely to persist for a while longer and will possibly spur core inflation. This in turn will be a major concern for markets and is certainly worth keeping an eye out for, as more Fed rate hikes may now loom on the horizon. I hope that you found this episode of CFI's Deeper Dive interesting and informative. Now, I've covered a lot of material about oil and commodities in general. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I would highly recommend that you take our most excellent course by Scott Powell, our Chief Content Officer, entitled Commodities Fundamentals. Thank you so much for listening this week, and we'll see you on the next CFI Deeper Dive.